You know what's crazy? The single worst decision Hitler ever made wasn't starting World War II. It was what he did on June 22, 1941. And if he hadn't made that choice, you might be living in a completely different world right now. See, everyone talks about how the Nazis lost the war. But here's what they don't tell you. By mid-1941, Hitler had basically won. France was defeated. Poland was gone. Most of Europe was either conquered or working with Germany. Britain was hanging on by a thread. The Nazi war machine looked unstoppable. And then Hitler made a decision that threw all of that away. He invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers pouring across the border into Soviet territory. The largest invasion in human history. And it destroyed Germany. But what if that never happened? What if Hitler just said no to that invasion? What if he focused everything on Britain instead? What if he kept that non-aggression pact with Stalin? That's what we're diving into today. And trust me, this gets wild that I'm going to walk you through exactly how World War II would have played out differently. We're talking about naval battles, strategic bombing campaigns, potential invasions, and a completely different map of Europe. By the end of this, you'll understand why this one decision changed literally everything about the world we live in today. Let's go back to June 1941. Hitler is standing at a crossroads. In our timeline, he chose to invade the Soviet Union. But in this alternate history, he makes a different choice. He decides to finish off Britain first. Now, before we get into what happens next, we need to understand the situation Hitler was actually in. Because this isn't just about changing one decision. We need to look at what resources Germany had, what their options were, and what was actually possible. By June 1941, Germany controlled most of continental Europe. They had France. They had the Low Countries. They had Norway and Denmark. They had Poland and Czechoslovakia. Austria was already part of Germany. Italy was their ally. Spain was friendly, even if they weren't officially in the war. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were all aligned with Germany. Britain was isolated. They had been pushed off the continent at Dunkirk. The Luftwaffe had tried to bomb them into submission during the Battle of Britain, but that hadn't worked. Still, Britain couldn't actually threaten Germany on land. They were stuck on their island, and Germany controlled everything else. The Soviet Union was a different story. Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler back in 1939. They had divided Poland between them. The Soviets had taken the Baltic states and parts of Romania. But everyone knew that peace wasn't going to last forever. Hitler hated communism. Stalin didn't trust Hitler. It was only a matter of time before they went to war. But here's the thing. Hitler didn't have to invade in 1941. He could have waited. He could have dealt with Britain first. And that's exactly what happens in our alternate timeline. What does Hitler do instead of invading the Soviet Union? He doubles down on the war against Britain. And this is where things get really interesting, because Germany actually had several options here. Option 1 was the U-boat campaign. Germany had been using submarines to sink British merchant ships in the Atlantic. This was called the Battle of the Atlantic, and it was absolutely critical. Britain is an island. They needed to import food, oil, weapons, and raw materials from overseas. If Germany could cut off those supply lines, Britain would starve. In our timeline, the U-boat campaign was pretty effective, but Germany never committed enough resources to it. They were too focused on the Eastern Front. But in this alternate timeline, without a war against the Soviet Union, Germany can build way more submarines. They can also pull experienced crews and commanders from other fronts and focus them entirely on the Atlantic. The numbers here are important. In our real timeline, Germany had maybe 20 to 30 operational U-boats in the Atlantic at any given time in 1941. That's not a lot. But if they're not fighting the Soviets, they could potentially double or triple that number. More submarines means more British ships sunk. More ships sunk means less food and fuel reaching Britain. By late 1941 and into 1942, Britain would be facing a serious crisis. Rationing would get even more severe. Cities would be running low on fuel. The British economy would be struggling. And the political pressure on Churchill would be enormous. But the U-boat campaign alone might not be enough to actually defeat Britain. So Germany pursues option 2. They go after the Mediterranean and the Middle East. This is huge, and a lot of people don't realize how important this theater of war actually was. The Mediterranean wasn't just some sideshow. It was the gateway to the Suez Canal, which connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Britain used the Suez Canal to move troops and supplies to and from India, Australia, and the rest of their empire. In our real timeline, Germany sent some forces to North Africa under Rommel, but it was never a priority. They were more focused on Russia. But in this alternate timeline, Germany goes all in on the Mediterranean. They reinforce Rommel with more tanks, more troops, and more supplies. They also put more pressure on Spain to enter the war. If Spain joins the Axis, Germany can potentially take Gibraltar, which is the British fortress controlling the entrance to the Mediterranean. Without Gibraltar, the entire British position in the Mediterranean collapses. Germany also works more closely with Italy to secure the central Mediterranean. They put more aircraft and naval forces in the region to cut off British supplies to Malta, which was a critical British base. Without Malta, Britain can't effectively defend their convoys to Egypt. By early 1942, Rommel's reinforced Afrika Korps is pushing hard into Egypt. In our real timeline, Rommel got close to Cairo, but was eventually pushed back at El Alamein because Germany couldn't supply him properly. But in this timeline, with no Eastern Front draining resources, Rommel has everything he needs. If Rommel takes Cairo and the Suez Canal, that's a massive blow to Britain. They lose their connection to India and the Far East. They lose access to Middle Eastern oil. Their entire position in the region crumbles. This would be devastating for British morale and would put even more pressure on Churchill's government. But here's where it gets even more interesting. With the Suez Canal in German hands, Hitler can potentially link up with his allies in a way that was never possible in our timeline. Japan had entered the war in December 1941 by attacking Pearl Harbor and invading Southeast Asia. If Germany controls the Middle East, they can coordinate with Japan. They can threaten British India from the west while Japan threatens it from the east. Now, we need to talk about the third option Germany has in this timeline: direct invasion of Britain. Operation Sea Lion. In our real history, Hitler considered invading Britain in 1940, but he called it off because the Luftwaffe couldn't win air superiority during the Battle of Britain, and the German Navy wasn't strong enough to protect an invasion fleet from the Royal Navy. But by 1942, in this alternate timeline, things have changed. Germany has had an extra year without fighting the Soviets to build up their air force and navy. The Luftwaffe has more planes and better trained pilots. The Kriegsmarine has more ships, including potentially some of those resources that were used for Operation Barbarossa. More importantly, Britain is weaker. The U-boat campaign has been strangling their supply lines. The loss of the Middle East has hurt their morale and resources. The RAF has been fighting nonstop for 2 years and is exhausted. Germany might actually be able to pull off an invasion of southern England. It would be incredibly risky. The English Channel is a nightmare to cross with an invasion force. The Royal Navy is still powerful. British coastal defenses are strong. But if Germany commits everything to it, if they achieve air superiority, if they time it right, they might succeed. An invasion of Britain doesn't have to conquer the whole island. If Germany can establish a beachhead in southern England, if they can take a major port, that might be enough to force Britain to negotiate. Churchill might be forced out of office. A new government might seek peace terms with Germany. And that's the key thing to understand here. Germany doesn't necessarily need to completely conquer Britain. They just need to force Britain out of the war. A negotiated peace where Britain recognizes German control of Europe would be a massive victory for Hitler. So let's say by mid to late 1942, Britain is on the ropes. The Atlantic lifeline is being severed. The Middle East is lost. Germany has either invaded or is seriously threatening invasion. The pressure becomes too much. Churchill's government falls. A new government, maybe led by someone who was always more skeptical of continuing the war, opens peace negotiations with Germany. What would those peace terms look like? Germany would want Britain to recognize their control over continental Europe. They'd want Britain to stay out of European affairs. They might demand some British colonies or naval bases. They definitely want Britain to stop supporting any resistance movements in occupied Europe. Britain, in exchange, would keep their independence and probably most of their empire, at least the parts Japan hasn't taken. They'd keep their fleet. They'd survive as a nation, but they'd be knocked out of the great power game. Now, here's where things get really complicated. What about the Soviet Union? Remember, in this timeline, Germany never invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. The Non-Aggression Pact is still technically in effect, but Stalin isn't stupid. He's been watching Germany conquer the rest of Europe. He knows that eventually, Hitler will come for him. So what does Stalin do? He prepares. And this is actually really important. In our real timeline, the Soviet Union was caught off guard by Operation Barbarossa. Their military was in the middle of a massive reorganization. Their border defenses were weak. They lost millions of soldiers in the first few months of the war because they weren't ready. But in this alternate timeline, the Soviets have an extra year or more to prepare. They're building more tanks, more planes, more artillery. They're training more soldiers. They're moving their factories further east, beyond the reach of German bombers. They're building defensive lines along their western border. By 1943, the Soviet Union is much stronger than it was in 1941. They've learned from watching Germany's tactics in the rest of Europe. They've modernized their military. They're ready. So when Germany finally does turn east, because let's be real, Hitler was always going to attack the Soviet Union eventually, it's a very different war. Germany would probably invade sometime in 1943 after dealing with Britain. They'd still have a powerful military. They'd have all those resources from conquered Europe. They'd have oil from the Middle East if they took it. But the Soviets would be much better prepared. This war would be even more brutal than the real Eastern Front. The Soviets would have better defenses, better equipment, and better leadership. They learned from their mistakes in the Winter War against Finland. They've had time to figure out their command structure. Germany would still make advances. They'd still be a terrifying military force, but it would be slower. The Soviet Union wouldn't collapse in the first few months like it nearly did in 1941. And here's the crucial difference. The United States. In our real timeline, the U.S. entered World War II in December 1941 after Pearl Harbor. They spent 1942 and 1943 building up their forces, fighting in North Africa and Italy, and preparing for D-Day. By 1944, they were landing in France and opening up a second front against Germany. But in this alternate timeline, if Britain has made peace with Germany by 1942 or 1943, what does America do? This is a huge question. The U.S. was still attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor. That probably still happens in this timeline because Japan's reasons for attacking the U.S. were mostly about the Pacific, not about Europe. So the U.S. is at war with Japan. But are they at war with Germany? That's less clear. In our timeline, Germany declared war on the U.S. right after Pearl Harbor because of their alliance with Japan. But if Germany has already defeated Britain and is trying to consolidate their gains, would Hitler really want to bring the U.S. into the war? Maybe Germany doesn't declare war on the U.S. Maybe they stay neutral toward each other, even while the U.S. fights Japan in the Pacific. This would be a weird situation. American public opinion was generally against the Nazis, but there was also a strong isolationist movement that didn't want to get involved in European wars. If Britain has already made peace, if the fighting in Europe is over, would the American public support going to war against Germany just on principle? It's possible the U.S. focuses entirely on the Pacific War against Japan. They might provide some support to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, sending weapons and supplies to help them fight Germany. But American soldiers might never fight in Europe. If that's the case, then the war between Germany and the Soviet Union becomes a purely continental struggle. No D-Day, no Western Front, just Germany and the Soviet Union grinding each other down in the largest land war in history. And here's the thing, that war would be long. It would be brutal. Both sides would throw everything they had at each other. Germany would have all of Europe's resources backing them up. The Soviet Union would have their vast manpower, their growing industrial base, and the advantage of fighting on their own territory. Who would win? That's really hard to say. In our real timeline, the Soviet Union won, but they had help from the Western Allies. American and British supplies were crucial. The bombing campaign against German cities and industry hurt Germany's ability to fight. And most importantly, Germany was fighting a two-front war, which divided their forces. In this alternate timeline, Germany doesn't have those problems, at least not as badly. They can focus everything on the Eastern Front. But the Soviets are also better prepared than they were in 1941. My guess? The war would drag on for years. We might see a stalemate develop, kind of like World War I, with massive front lines across Eastern Europe that barely move. Both sides would suffer enormous casualties. Millions and millions of people would die. Eventually, one of two things would happen. Either one side would slowly gain the upper hand and start pushing the other back, or both sides would be so exhausted that they'd negotiate some kind of peace. If Germany wins, they'd control everything from the Atlantic to potentially the Urals. It would be the largest empire in European history. Hitler's nightmare vision of Lebensraum, living space in the East, would be reality. If the Soviet Union wins, they'd push Germany back and probably occupy all of Europe. You'd see communist governments installed in France, Italy, Spain, everywhere. The Cold War would look very different because there would be no Western Europe for the US to protect. Or maybe neither side wins. Maybe by 1945 or 1946, both Germany and the Soviet Union are exhausted. They've been fighting for years. Millions are dead. Their economies are shattered. And they agree to a peace treaty that basically leaves the borders somewhere in the middle of Eastern Europe. That would create a very different post-war world. Germany would keep most of Western and Central Europe. The Soviet Union would keep their pre-war territory and maybe some gains in the East. And there would be a tense, hostile border between them, with both sides preparing for the next round. Now let's talk about what this world would actually look like if Germany doesn't get completely defeated like in our timeline. First, the Holocaust. This is really dark, but we have to address it. In our real history, the Nazis murdered 6 million Jews and millions of other people they considered undesirable. Most of this happened during the war, especially after the invasion of the Soviet Union. In this alternate timeline, the Holocaust still happens. The Nazi ideology doesn't change. They still believe in racial superiority. They still hate Jews, Roma, disabled people, political opponents, and others. If anything, without the military pressure of a two-front war, they might have been even more efficient at carrying out genocide. If Germany actually wins or achieves a stalemate that lets them keep their conquered territories, the Holocaust might be even worse because they'd have years of peacetime to implement their horrific policies without the disruption of military defeat. This is one of the darkest aspects of this alternate timeline. Nazi Germany surviving means Nazi ideology surviving, at least for longer. Second, the map of Europe would be completely different. France would probably remain under German occupation or have a puppet government. Poland wouldn't exist as an independent nation. Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states, all gone, absorbed into Greater Germany or turned into puppet states. Britain would be independent but isolated and much weaker. They'd probably lose a lot of their empire over time without the prestige of victory. India might gain independence earlier. Britain's role as a great power would be over. The Soviet Union, assuming they survived, would be contained in the East. Eastern Europe might be a contested zone, or it might be firmly under German control, depending on how the war went. Third, what about the United States? In our timeline, America emerged from World War II as a superpower. They had the strongest economy, the most powerful military, and they led the creation of the post-war order with the United Nations, NATO, and the Marshall Plan. In this alternate timeline, none of that happens, or it happens very differently. America is still powerful, sure. They probably still defeat Japan in the Pacific. They might even still develop the atomic bomb and use it on Japan to end that war. But their role in Europe is much smaller. They're not liberators. They didn't save Western Europe from the Nazis. So they don't have the same influence or the same moral authority. The Cold War, if it happens at all, would be between the United States and Nazi Germany instead of the United States and the Soviet Union. Think about that. Instead of competing ideologies of capitalism versus communism, you'd have democracy versus fascism as the main global conflict. Germany would be trying to export fascist ideology. They'd be supporting far-right movements around the world. The US would be trying to contain them, maybe fighting proxy wars in South America, Africa, or Asia to stop German influence from spreading. Or maybe Germany and the US just divide the world into spheres of influence. Germany dominates Europe and possibly parts of Africa and the Middle East. The US dominates the Americas and the Pacific. They eye each other suspiciously across the Atlantic but avoid direct conflict because both have too much to lose. Fourth, technology and science. This is interesting because a lot of the technological advances in our world came from World War II and the Cold War space race. Jet engines, rockets, radar, computers, nuclear energy, all of this was accelerated by the war. In this alternate timeline, you'd still get technological progress, but it might develop differently. Germany was actually pretty advanced in some areas. They had early jets. They had rocket technology. If they survive as a major power into the 1950s and beyond, they might pursue some of these technologies even further. But you'd also have a brain drain problem. In our timeline, tons of scientists fled Europe to escape the Nazis, especially Jewish scientists like Einstein. They went to America and Britain and helped those countries develop new technologies. In this alternate timeline, if Germany dominates Europe, where do those scientists go? Some might make it to America, but others might be trapped or killed. That could slow down scientific progress overall. Fifth, culture and society. Imagine growing up in a world where Nazi Germany is still around, where fascist ideology is a legitimate competing system with democracy, where the symbols and ideas of the Nazis are part of normal political discourse. It's a darker, more oppressive world, at least in Europe. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, human rights. All of these things that we take for granted in modern Western society wouldn't exist in German-controlled Europe. You'd have secret police, censorship, propaganda, all the apparatus of a totalitarian state. And it might be normalized. People who grow up in that system might not know anything different. They might accept it as normal. That's a really disturbing thought. Okay, so we've walked through this whole alternate history. Germany doesn't invade the Soviet Union in 1941. They focus on defeating Britain instead. They potentially succeed in forcing Britain out of the war. Then they turn east and fight the Soviet Union, but it's a different, maybe longer war. The United States might not get fully involved in Europe. The post-war world is divided differently, with Nazi Germany as a surviving major power. What's the big takeaway from all this? I think it's understanding just how pivotal Operation Barbarossa was. That decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941 was the turning point of World War II. It opened up the massive Eastern Front that eventually destroyed the German military. It brought the Soviet Union into the war on the Allied side, which was crucial for ultimate victory. And it happened at a moment when Germany could have made different choices. If Hitler had been more patient, if he'd focused on one enemy at a time, if he'd consolidated his gains before pushing for more, World War II might have gone very differently. Germany might not have won ultimately, but they could have lasted longer. They could have forced a negotiated peace that let them keep some of their conquests. The world we live in would be radically different. But Hitler wasn't patient. He was driven by ideology, by his hatred of communism, by his dreams of empire in the East. And so he invaded the Soviet Union, and that decision ultimately led to Germany's destruction. History is full of these moments where one decision changes everything. And Operation Barbarossa might be the biggest one of the 20th century. If you want to see more alternate history scenarios, click on the next video.